love to introduce yourself for people like Akash, who are not from the developer background and who would love to understand who you are. So I guess if you are someone who have worked in JavaScript or who knows any bit of event management or who have ever worked on React or Redux, you must have heard Mark Erikson, who the guy is. The person, so whenever there is any mention of React or Redux across the internet, and if you will definitely find him answering on that thread. The developer who is behind the great Simpson avatar is, I guess, the Mark Erikson. So,
Hi.
of course, I mean, you can add something to that which I have missed. And Akash, I guess you got an idea who Mark is.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I'll pretend that I'm understanding everything what Mark is saying, and my nod will be like, yeah, absolutely, I understand that.
So, Mark, I think for your reference, Akash is a designer, so he have nothing to do with
Okay.
React or Redux.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I'll just moderate silently.
Cool.
Cool.
So yeah, Mark, over to you.
Okay. I'll go ahead and pull up my screen. All right. Good to go? Okay. Greetings, folks. I guess it's late evening over there. It's late morning here in the US. Hi, my name is Mark Erikson, and today I'm happy to be talking to you about modern Redux with Redux Toolkit. We had the introduction, but I'll recap a few things about myself. I'm currently a senior front-end engineer at Replay.io, where we're building a true time-traveling debugger for JavaScript applications. It's kind of funny because when Redux was first announced, one of the big selling points was the ability to do time travel, and Replay is actually a much more advanced version of that concept, where you can record any application that runs in a browser and then debug the recording later. And it's a really, really incredible tool. I'm excited about the stuff that we're building. And if you haven't had a chance to check it out yet, please do. A couple other things about myself. As mentioned, I am an answer of questions. I will respond to pretty much any question about React and Redux anywhere there's a text box on the internet. I collect useful and interesting links to all kinds of resources about React and Redux and web development. I am a writer of extremely long blog posts, and I am a Redux maintainer. I created Redux Toolkit, which we'll talk about here in a couple minutes. I wrote React Redux versions 7 and 8, and I've written large portions of our documentation, including the current Redux tutorials. And yes, as mentioned, I am that guy with the Simpsons avatar. I do have an actual face, but what most people know me is that picture. So let's talk about complaints people have had with Redux over the years. And you can really break these down into a few distinct categories. One is that configuring a Redux store is too complicated. Like, yeah, you only have to do it one time per application, but every time you've got to go through the same 30 or 40 lines of code to, apply some middleware and compose them together, and like all this store setup every time. Another is that you have to install a whole bunch of different packages every time you use Redux. You need Redux Thunk to have the Thunk middleware. You need to add reselect so you have selectors, maybe a few other things on top of that. Another common complaint is that it's really easy to make mistakes, like accidentally mutating state, which has always been historically the #1 bug in Redux applications. But by far the most common complaint, and the word I've come to hate over the last several years, is boilerplate. And when people say there's too much boilerplate with Redux, they're usually referring to a few different things. Things like having to write action type strings or action creator functions, or handwrite immutable update logic, or people thinking that you have to write many different files for one piece of feature code, or the store setup process. And frankly, these were all very valid concerns with using Redux. So why did all this boilerplate even exist? Well, some of it is that Redux does deliberately add a level of indirection as part of its design. If you compare the idea of dispatching actions and writing reducer functions to something like, object.field equals 1, 2, 3, Redux will always have more work to make an update because Redux was designed to separate the idea of describing what happened by dispatching an action with the idea of how did my state update in a reducer. So that's part of Redux's design intentionally. But there were a bunch of other reasons. One is that some of the common Redux usage patterns added more indirection and things that you had to try and do. Another is that there's ways that you're supposed to use Redux that we've described in our documentation, but the code itself never actually enforced that. So you just had to keep this stuff in your head. Things like you have to write immutable updates. You need to avoid having serializable or non-serializable values in the store. You need to avoid side effects and reducers. Another is that the JavaScript language is mutable by default. You have to do a lot of extra work to do immutable updates, and writing correct immutable updates is really hard. And finally, the Redux core was designed to be very small and minimal, and to have a larger ecosystem of add-ons built on top of that. So the idea is that the core had very little functionality built in, and that meant you had to configure your store with all the specific add-ons and setup that you're using in your application. So I would divide all this into inherent versus incidental complexity. The word inherent means something that is built in. It's part of the nature of whatever this situation is. So there is inherent complexity in Redux. The idea of dispatching actions and writing reducers is part of Redux. If you take it away, that's not Redux anymore. But other complexity is incidental. It's not required. It's not a key part of the design. So, for example, organizing your code into folders by type, like a reducers folder and an actions folder and a constants folder, is not required in Redux. It was just a common thing that people did. Having to handwrite immutable updates it's not required. Like, yes, you have to do immutable updates, but writing all the object spreads is not the only way to do immutable updates. Having to write action creators like const add to do equals add underscore to do, it's not required. It's just a common practice that was shown in the early documentation. Same with writing action creators, or things like the community deciding that using the Redux Saga library or defining action type unions with TypeScript were good things to do. So we did teach some of these patterns in the docs, but again, they weren't necessary to use Redux. So what if we could remove all this incidental complexity and make Redux easier to learn and use? And that's why we created Redux Toolkit. Redux Toolkit is an official package from us, the Redux maintainers, and it was kind of inspired by Create React App in a lot of ways. Back in the early days of React, around like 2014, 2015, every React tutorial started with, here's 15 pages of setting up Webpack and Babel from scratch before you can write your first line of React code. And Create React App was designed to hide all that complexity by giving you a good Webpack and Babel configuration out of the box, so that all you have to do is say Create React App, my app, and you get a project and it just works and you can start writing React code right away. So Redux Toolkit has a lot of the same idea. It's designed to simplify common Redux use cases, provide good defaults out of the box, minimize the amount of code you have to write by hand, but at the same time, it doesn't hide the fact that we're using Redux. Like, this is still Redux, just with less code to write. It is opt-in. You can add it piece by piece to an existing project, or you can use it day one on a new project. And we've designed it to have a great experience if you're using TypeScript. When this first came out, we actually called it Redux Starter Kit, but this actually was kind of confusing for people. They didn't know, like, is this a boilerplate repository that I'm supposed to copy paste? Is this something that's only good for beginners? And so like a month or two after we released Redux Starter Kit 1.0, we renamed it to Redux Toolkit to make it more clear what this does. Redux Toolkit is written in TypeScript, and it's definitely designed to simplify using Redux and TypeScript together. A lot of the work on that has been done by my co-maintainer, Lenz Weber. So Redux Toolkit is good for all Redux users, whether you're brand new to Redux or you've been using it since 2015. It will make life easier for everybody. So let's look at what's actually included in Redux Toolkit. And the starting point is a function called configure store. Now, this is a wrapper around the original Redux create store function. And the idea is it simplifies the process of doing all the usual steps you would have to run to create a Redux store. If you look at this code over here, this is pretty short and simple. In fact, you notice what we've done is we've just supplied an object that has some of our slice reducers, and that's it. And with that one call, configure store has automatically passed those to combine reducers to combine them together. It's added the Redux Thunk middleware, and in development, an additional middleware to check for accidental mutations. It's also turned on the Redux DevTools extension. So if you have the extension added in your browser, you'll be able to see all the actions and state changes happening. And it did all the composition of the middleware and the DevTools stuff. So in one simple function call, we've created a Redux store that did the combining, that has some safety checks set up, and adds all the usual things you would have done to create a Redux store. It is more flexible if you want. You can, if you need to, you can create the root reducer separately and pass that in. You can customize the middleware that we're actually using. You can configure whether the Redux DevTools are turned on or off, or if you need to pass in some special options to the DevTools, you could do that. And you can pass in a preloaded initial state as well. So you can still do all the same things you could have done with the original create store function, but it's a lot easier to use. You'll also notice that this takes one parameter that is an object with named fields instead of multiple separate parameters without names. Now, we said earlier that writing immutable updates is really hard. And that's because you have to make sure that you copy every level of nesting that you want to update. So if I have an object and I want to update state.first.second, like bracket 5.value or something like that, you have to do all these levels of copy. You got to copy state, define first, copy state.first, define second, map over this array, return this thing, copy the item, and override the value field. It's a pain. That's a lot of code. It's really easy to make mistakes. And this is one of the reasons why it is really easy to accidentally mutate state, like if you accidentally forget to do one of these steps. So there's a really cool library called Immer from a guy named Michel Westrate who created the MobX library. And with Immer, you have a function called produce. You pass in an existing plain JavaScript value, and you then provide a callback function that gets what looks like the exact same value as its parameter. And inside of here, it is safe to write code that actually mutates nested fields inside that object. But what Immer has done is wrap your initial data in an ES6 proxy object that lets Immer intercept all the attempts to mutate fields, and it tracks those. And when you're done, it replays them and turns it into a safe, correct, immutable update. So this line right here is actually identical to these 12 lines right here. And the result is the exact same as if we'd done all the copies by hand. Immer makes immutable updates really, really easy. And so that is why we use Immer by default in Redux Toolkit. So the next function in Redux Toolkit is called Create Reducer. And the idea is that it's instead of having to write switch statements, we can provide an object where the keys are Redux action type strings and the values are case reducer functions that handle updates for that action. So in this example, I've got your typical Redux to-do list reducer. And you notice that when we add a to-do, I can push and mutate the array. And as long as I run that code inside of Create Reducer, it's safe to do that because Create Reducer actually uses Immer inside automatically. So we can write mutating updates as long as it's inside of Create Reducer and Immer. We also have a Create Action utility, and this just generates an action creator function for a given type string. So if I say create an action for the type to-do/to-do added, I get a function back that can take a parameter and it will use that as the payload field for a Redux action object. It is possible to use those with Create Reducer. And in fact, Create Reducer also has an alternate form where you can pass in a function and add handling of cases or matching some other types using these action creator functions. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. So we've got Create Reducer and Create Action, but honestly, most of what we do in Redux is we just want to write reducers. Like we shouldn't have to even think about writing action creators most of the time. So while Create Reducer and Create Action exist, what you're actually going to use in almost all your Redux code is a function called Create Slice. Create Slice takes 3 parameters. There's a string name field, there's an initial state, and then there's an object called reducers. And inside of this object, you define case reducers and you give them good names like to-do added or to-do toggled. And for every one of these reducers, Create Slice is going to generate a corresponding action creator function with the same name. So in this example, I wrote a reducer function and called it, to-do toggled. Redux Toolkit generated an action creator function with the same name. And later on, I can dispatch that action, same as always, and this reducer code will run. Now, this also uses the same Create Reducer and Immer inside, so it is safe to write mutating code inside these reducers because we have Immer. And this is the way you really should write all of your Redux reducers today. You notice we didn't have to write any action type strings. We didn't have to write any action types or any action creators or switch statements or anything else. We just write a couple functions, give them names. We get the action creator for free, and it generates the reducer for that slice. Now, with Redux, we've always encouraged the idea that many reducer functions can listen to the same action type at the same time. For example, maybe you dispatch a user logged out action, and now you need to clear the data from many different slices at once. If you were writing a Redux reducer by hand, you would just add that type string to the switch statement. So how do we do that with Create Slice? Well, Create Slice has another field called Extra Reducers. And this gives the slice the ability to respond to other actions that were defined elsewhere in the program. So we provide a function and it gets a builder object. And now I can say builder.addCase, and I can listen for other actions by passing in a Redux action creator, or I can say add matcher, and I can pass in a function that could handle one of several different Redux action types, or I can even provide a default case if nothing else matched. When you're writing one of these slice files, we would typically have you call create slice to generate the reducer and the action creators. And then if you have something like a Redux thunk, you could put the thunks in that same file to keep them close together. Now, we've always encouraged the use of selector functions to derive data from the store. And so, and typically you would use the reselect library to generate memo-wise selector functions. So we just re-export the exact same create selector function from reselect as part of the Redux Toolkit package, just so you don't have to install or reselect separately. It's already there. You just import it and use it the same way. So those are really the basics that we expect you to use in every program. You're going to use configure store to create the store, create slice to write your reducers. You'll probably have some selectors. Now we get into some other APIs that you might not use in every Redux program, but these are common things that people need to do with Redux. We've always taught that for basic data fetching, you should use thunks. And it's very standard to dispatch an action before you make the request. So you can say like load, like status is loading. Maybe you want to show a spinner in the UI. And then you want to make the async request. And then you dispatch a success or failure action afterwards based on whether the request succeeded or failed. So to simplify that pattern, we have another API called create async thunk. And the idea is you provide a partial type string, and then you just provide a function that makes the async request and returns the data as a promise. And create async thunk will take care of automatically generating all the Redux action types and action creators. And when you dispatch the thunk, it automatically dispatches the pending action before the request, and then the fulfilled or rejected actions after the request. And then you can handle those actions in your slice using slice.extra reducers. So in this case, I made my fetch user by ID thunk. I'm going to handle the fulfilled action in this slice. And the process is to, in this case, push the data into an array inside of the state. So it's all the same things you used to write by hand, just with less code, again. Another thing that is very common to do is to store data as a normalized lookup table where the keys are the IDs of the items and the values are the items you got back. So because of this, we have another API called Create Entity Adapter. And this provides some pre-built reducers for inserting, updating, and removing items from that normalized lookup table. Create Entity Adapter also has the ability to do things like automatically keeping these values sorted as well. And it provides pre-built selectors to say, okay, all these items are stored in a lookup table, but now I need to convert that back into an array so I can show the list in the UI. So it has the ability to generate some selector functions for you to read that data out in the components. Okay, so we've recently added, within the last year, 2 major new APIs to Redux Toolkit. One of these is called RTK query. If you look at how the React ecosystem has changed over the last couple years, we've really shifted a lot from this idea of managing state to the idea of data fetching and caching. And that's why libraries like Apollo and React Query and SWR and Urkel have become very, very popular. People don't want to have to think about managing loading state and dispatching funcs and kicking this off in an effect. They just want to say, like, call a hook called use get my data and have it magically manage loading state, and then the data just shows up in your component. They don't want to have to think about this stuff. So RTK query is a data fetching and caching API that is part of Redux Toolkit. And the idea is it can completely abstract the data fetching process. Let's look at how this works. So RTK query starts with a new function called create API that is part of the Redux Toolkit package. You call create API and you define a base query. So for example, if I'm going to fetch some Pokemon, I would say that all my queries or all my requests are going to start by talking to this URL as a starting point. Then you define an endpoint. And in this case, I'm going to call the endpoint get Pokemon by name. And it's going to accept a parameter like the name of the Pokemon. And we're going to turn that into another piece of the URL, like /Pokemon/name. That automatically generates a React hook with the name of the endpoint, like use get Pokemon by name query. And then in a component, I can just say use get Pokemon by name query Pikachu. And it automatically gives me back the data that was fetched from the server, any errors, and the loading state. And it will automatically start the request and re-render the component as we get the data back. Now, RTK query is not specific to React. You can use it with any UI framework, but we do have the React-specific hooks functionality built in. So you can use this with REST APIs, GraphQL, and any async function that can fetch data from anywhere. So RTK query can replace potentially all of the data fetching code that you've got in your Redux apps right now. You can also do a lot more complex stuff with RTK query. So typically you would have one of these API slices per server that you're talking to with many endpoints defined, and it just stores the data as the server returned it. If you want to transform some of the data as it comes back, you can, but it does not try to share values between two different responses. You can also do things like maybe you've got a list component that fetched the data, and now you just need to read out one piece of that in a component so you can select out pieces of the response. You also have some powerful things like cache query lifecycles. Maybe you need to fetch the initial data over Ajax, but then you need to open up a WebSocket and get more messages that are sent from the server over time, like in a chat room. So we give you life cycles so you have the ability to like subscribe to a channel, receive messages, update the cache, and then unsubscribe from the channel when you're done. We also recently added a new side effect middleware called the listener middleware. Traditionally, if you wanted to have code that ran in response to dispatched actions or changes in state, you needed to use really complex tools like Redux Saga or Redux Observable. And those work, but they're really complicated. They're also kind of large in terms of bundle size. So in Redux Toolkit 1.8, we added this new listener middleware, and it solves the same kind of problems as Sagas or Observables, but it's much smaller and has a much simpler API. You can think of it as kind of like React's use effect, but for Redux store updates. So the idea is you create the listener middleware, and then you add an entry by calling middleware.startListening. And you can match against one action type, many different action types, and you provide an effect function that gets the action as a parameter, and it also gets a listener API object that lets you do things like dispatch more actions, get the state, cancel other running listeners, and much more. And then you add the listener middleware to the store. So on the one hand, this is built into Redux Toolkit. It's based on async await, so that's pretty familiar. It's very lightweight in like API design, and it works great with TypeScript. Now, this is fairly new, so I can't say that it's like being used in lots of programs yet, but we spent a lot of time trying to design this. And there are probably a few things that sagas and observables can do that the listener middleware can't. A couple other neat things you can do with listeners. You can match against not just actions, but state values. So maybe you only want this to run when state.counter.value changed. You can also have your listener wait for certain things. Like maybe you want to pause the code until a certain action gets dispatched. You can kick off little child tasks and wait for them to complete. And you can even add listeners anywhere you can dispatch, which means you could even add a listener inside a component, like in a use effect hook. So this is a really powerful new API to let you run code in response to things happening with the Redux store. One other thing to note with Redux Toolkit is we automatically add some safety checks in development. By far the most common mistake people have made with Redux is accidentally mutating. You might have done it in a reducer, or maybe you did it outside. Like a common thing people do is they try to sort an array, except that sort mutates the existing array. And so maybe you were trying to sort it in your component and you accidentally mutated the state. Well, Redux Toolkit automatically adds a mutability check middleware in development. And if you accidentally mutate state, it will throw errors. There's also a check for putting non-serializable values like class instances or maps and sets into the state as well. On top of that, Immer actually makes it almost impossible to accidentally mutate because mutating code gets turned into immutable updates and it actually freezes the state after it's done. So this fixes the #1 bug with Redux apps over the years. So how do you use Redux and TypeScript today? Well, our standard recommendation is that you use Redux Toolkit's configure store, and then you ask TypeScript, hey, figure out what the state type is from the store, and figure out what the type of the dispatch function is from the store. And then you set up some predefined hooks that have these types baked in. So we would suggest having a use app dispatch hook that uses this app dispatch type, and a use app selector hook that knows what the root state type is. And then you should use those everywhere in your program. And this makes sure that all the components have the correct types for state and dispatch everywhere. So in the application, in create slice, you would define a type for the slice of state. You would define the types for your Redux actions. And then in your components, you use the use app selector and use dispatch hooks. And that's it. Like you don't have to define action type unions or all this other complicated stuff. As far as using Redux Toolkit today, you can add it to an existing application. If you're setting up a new project using Create React App, we have templates for plain JavaScript and TypeScript. There is a with Redux template for Next that already has Redux and TypeScript set up. And I think there aren't official templates for Vite, but I think there are a few community written templates that have Redux Toolkit and TypeScript already configured. One other thing that I want to note, I recently released Redux version 4.2.0, the original Redux library. And that version makes one change, and this is a very small but very important change. And that is that I have marked the original Redux create store method as deprecated. Now, why did I do this? And what does this mean? So we released Redux Toolkit 3 years ago. We've been teaching it in our documentation as the standard since 2020. And a lot of people have switched over to using Redux Toolkit. But there are a lot of people who are still reading tutorials from like 2016 or 2017 that never got updated. There are people who have courses on Udemy that say updated for 2022, but no, it's like material from 2016 with like a couple lessons on hooks and stuff added at the end. And so there are people or like boot camps that say like, here's 4 weeks of JavaScript, 4 weeks of React, 4 weeks of Redux, go. And they're still teaching Redux patterns that are many years old and out of date. And these people have no idea that modern Redux is much easier to learn and use, and they don't know that Redux Toolkit exists. So I very firmly believe I am not going to break running code. I could put out a Redux version 5 that like deletes create store, but that would break people's code because they would try to follow a tutorial, they'd install the latest version of Redux, it doesn't have create store anymore, and it breaks. I'm not going to do that to people. So I tried to do the smallest thing that I could possibly do to let people know that there is a better way to write Redux code today without breaking anybody's code. So create store now has the @deprecated tag attached to it. And that means that if you import Redux from the latest version, or create store from the latest version of Redux, it has a little strike through. That's it. It doesn't break. It doesn't print any runtime warnings. It just has the little visual line through it. And if you hover over it, the information message now says, we recommend using configure store from Redux Toolkit instead. So what I want to have happen is that somebody's going through a boot camp or following an old tutorial, they see the strike through, they hover over it, and now they learn that Redux Toolkit exists, and hopefully they start to use it instead. If you're using old Redux and for some reason you don't want to upgrade, number one, you should upgrade. Number two, there's three ways to make this go away. You can switch to importing the new legacy create store function, which is exactly the same thing, but with no warning. You can just ignore it because literally nothing about your code breaks. We have had some people complain about this. There's some people who don't like Redux Toolkit. I think they're wrong, but they've made their decision. But like other library maintainers have agreed that like Redux is one of the very few libraries where so many people are using outdated approaches that are much, much harder to use. And so anything that we can do to try to like let people know that there's a better way needs to be done. So in summary, Redux Toolkit is how you're supposed to use Redux today. And we designed it to solve all the problems that people experience with using Redux. It simplifies your store setup to a single function call. It eliminates accidental mutations, eliminates the need to write action creators or action types by hand, makes it really easy to write the code for a feature in a single file instead of spreading it across 4 or 5 files. It works great with TypeScript. And if you want to use RTK query, it can eliminate the need to write any data fetching code by hand. So we want everybody who's using Redux to use Redux Toolkit for all the Redux code. Now, one other note is that you can add this to a program piece by piece. If you have a large Redux project that is, lots of reducers that are written in the old styles, you can add this very piecemeal and do the conversion over time. I do that with my day job at Replay. Like probably only half, less than half of our reducers are using create slice right now. But the idea is you switch the store setup for configure store, and then just pick one reducer at a time, change that to create slice and replace the actions. All the other reducers still work, and then you can keep changing that as you go. I don't have these slides up on my blog yet. I will try to put them there in the next day or two so you can see this and follow all the links and refer back to it. I do have links to some of the documentation pages and tutorials, and a couple of the articles on my blog where I talked about how we designed Redux Toolkit. Okay, let's see. So we're about 35, 40-ish minutes. So I was close. That was about what I said I'd be doing.
Absolutely. Well, it was an amazing session because I got to learn a lot for Redux Toolkit. We are using Redux Toolkit in our Peerlist app. So when I started searching for Redux, I got to know about it, and that is where we decided that this must be a good solution, and that is where we started. So I can vouch on that, and we have some questions in the chat. So
questions, yay!
So I think Prajakta have some interesting question that continuous updates via WebSocket connection using RTK is a good approach, or it will get more complex. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So like I said, there's a couple different ways you can do this. So if you look at the Redux FAQ, there is under the code structure heading, there's a specific entry that says like, what is the right place for a WebSocket inside of a Redux application? And so we've traditionally advised that the right place for a WebSocket in a Redux app is to put it inside of a middleware. And that's because middleware have the ability to see dispatched actions that are going through the pipeline, and they have the ability to dispatch more actions themselves. So you could like actually tell the socket send this message to the server by dispatching an action to the middleware, and it looks for those actions, or it can receive messages from the server and turn those into actions instead. So generally we would say put sockets in a middleware. Sort of related to that, I had the one slide where I showed if you're using RTK query and you have like the chat room example where we start by fetching a list of all messages from the server via an AJAX request, but then we want to receive more messages over time via a WebSocket, you could potentially like create the WebSocket in the RTK query lifecycle handler. So we start to handle the messages for a chat room, we fetch all of them, we subscribe to more messages and update the cache, and then the user closes the chat room and we close the WebSocket.
I hope, Prajakta, that is an answer to your question. If you have a follow-up question, you can add it to the chat. So, Mark, Abhishek, I have a question that why don't I get any errors or warnings when I use selected hook in an if condition? I don't know how relatable it is, but still, yeah.
Good question. My first question would be, do you have the React rules of hooks lint warning turned on in ESLint? You won't get warnings at runtime, which is why the lint rule exists. So with some of the ways that hooks work, you almost need a compiler to tell you ahead of time you're doing this wrong. And so the ESLint rules for hooks really are that ahead of time warning. Like if you put a hook, whether it be useSelector or something else, inside of an if statement, and that component always follows the exact same line, like it always is, that condition is yes and it goes inside, the code will run because it keeps using the same number of hooks every time. But if you run that component and the first time the condition is true and the second time the condition is false, then you will get a runtime error because React says, wait, last time we did 3 hooks, this time we only did 2 hooks. This is not correct. And at that point, it explodes. So it might work some of the time, but you really should turn on the lint warning because it will catch mistakes like that.
Right. And just a compliment for you from Kinjal that I recently got back to Redux after some time. And while using Create Store, VS Code suggested me that Redux Toolkit. And oh my God, I love everything about it. And it makes everything so much better. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And you see, it sounds like that Create Store deprecation is working as intended.
Yes. And one more amazing question from Sai. If we use server state management libraries like React Query, do you think the need for client-side management libraries like Redux Toolkit will reduce greatly? And for the little client state that remains, we can use a light library like Context or Justin.
Yeah, so this is a question that comes up very frequently, and it really has to do with why are you using Redux in the first place? Redux is a very low-level generic holder for any kind of state, and you can use it for state that only lives on the client. You can use it to hold data that was fetched from the server. You can put anything into Redux. So if the only thing that you were using Redux for was to cache data that was fetched from the server, then yes, it's very likely that if you switch to a purpose-built server state caching tool like a React query or an Apollo or an SWR, then you probably don't need Redux anymore because you just replaced the one thing that you were using Redux for at all. But a couple other thoughts on that. One is that RTK query was designed to solve that exact same problem as a React query or an Apollo. And like generally our recommendation today is that if you are using Redux and you need to do server state data fetching, you should use RTK query. If you are not using Redux and you need to do data fetching, then you should use React query or Apollo or other similar tools. But generally, don't write data fetching code by hand, regardless of what you're doing otherwise. The other observation is that, yeah, like if most of what you were doing with Redux was server state, and you switch to like a React query or something, then you probably don't have much client-specific state left over, and you probably can handle it just fine with basic React component state or maybe zoo stand or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, but one problem which I have always faced is the use context end up re-rendering your app a lot, and that is where the major problem of use context comes in. So I think one more compliment from Deepak that there is no well-established store management library other than Redux in the market.
I would actually push back on that slightly. Like, there are many other good tools. MobX, ZooStand, Jotai, Recoil. There are a lot of other good tools in the React ecosystem. And I've said for years, like, I don't want everybody to use Redux because Redux is not the right tool for every problem. And so, like, if you are using MobX or you prefer MobX or Recoil or ZooStand, that's great. Like, all I want people to do is take the time to think about what problems do I need to solve in my program? What kinds of tools can help solve these problems? And then make an informed decision and pick a tool that is a good solution for those problems. And preference goes into that. Like, if I prefer writing classes and just kind of having everything automatically update for me, MobX is a much better choice than Redux because Redux is more functional programming and being explicit about like this component needs this data. So I don't want everybody to use Redux. I just want people to take the time and think about what tools should I use to solve a problem.
Right. So Deepak have one more question, that do we still need to use queries and use mutation hooks for making GraphQL API calls?
Yeah, so RTK query defines two kinds of endpoints. You have queries for fetching data and keeping it in the store, and you have mutations for sending an update to the server. So React query is a little more generic, and it literally has a hook called use query and a hook called use mutation. With RTK query, you say this endpoint is a query endpoint. This endpoint is a mutation endpoint, and it generates the hooks to go along with that. So you might have, use get to do's query as a hook name, and like use toggle to do mutation as a hook name. So that's true no matter no matter how you are talking to the server. Doesn't matter whether it's a REST API or a GraphQL API or like a Firebase client SDK. It's all, you're either fetching data from the server or you're telling the server to update. So queries and mutations.
Absolutely. So I think we'll take a couple of more questions before we call off for the evening. So I think
Sure.
Gurkin have one, that is the package size of Redux Toolkit larger than native Redux with other dependencies?
Yes and no. So the baseline Redux package is about 2 KB minified, I think. Redux Toolkit is larger than that by definition because Redux Toolkit is the Redux core plus more stuff on top of that. So basic math, it's going to be bigger. But a couple things. Number one, it includes the common libraries like Reselect and Redux Thunk and Immer that you probably were already using in your own Redux code anyway. So in that sense, there's not much additional change. And if you look at the actual JavaScript code in the bundles from functions like configure store or create slice, those are actually really small. There's a lot of TypeScript code, but the JavaScript code that comes from that is actually pretty small. Create entity adapter adds a few more kilobytes. RTK query is maybe another 12 to 15 kilobytes minified on top of all the RTK stuff, but that's a one-time cost. And you could add like another 20 or 25 endpoints, and it's only a few more bytes per endpoint. And if you compare that to the amount of code you would have had to write all the thunks and the reducers and everything else, like RTK query or even like create slice, like the curve of like if I wrote all the code myself versus like if I use RTK, like it very soon passes a point where the amount of code from using RTK is smaller than if I wrote all this code myself by hand. So yeah, it is larger than the base Redux library, but that code pays for itself. And it should tree shake based on what you use. So like if you only use configure store and create slice, you won't pay the cost for create entity adapter or RTK query.
Understood. One question from Laksh. How is the experience of maintaining Redux library with React 18 features? Did it have breaking changes to address?
This is a great question. So we put out React Redux version 8 about a month and a half, 2 months ago. the development process on that goes back to last summer. So there's 3 major sets of changes in React Redux version 8. One is that we converted the library to be written in TypeScript. The different Redux libraries have all handled TypeScript in different ways. The Redux core has always been written in plain JavaScript, but we have the TypeScript definitions in the repository written by us. Redux Toolkit, we converted to TypeScript years ago. React Redux, though, has always been written in plain JavaScript, and the type definitions were written by the community and kept in the definitely typed repo. And so it was by far time to switch that over to being written in TypeScript. So last summer, I just said, hey, I would like to convert React Redux to TypeScript. I would like some help doing this. And I just put out a request for help on Twitter, and a whole bunch of people just started like submitting a PR to change the initial build setup, changing 2 or 3 files at a time. And so within 3-4 weeks, we had the entire repository converted to TypeScript, and we used the existing community types as the starting point. From there, I went in and I ripped out some old dead options and APIs that weren't being used anymore. And then we started working on React 18 compatibility. The biggest thing with React 18 is that React now has this capability called concurrent rendering, where it can pause rendering halfway through, let the browser handle some events, and then keep going. What happens if an action gets dispatched while it's paused? Well, now it rendered the first half of the component tree with data A, and it renders the second half of the component tree with a second state. And that means like different parts of the UI are running with different data. That's probably bad. So the React team in React 18 added a new hook called use sync external store, specifically so that libraries like React Redux can handle that case better. So React Redux 8 was actually the test bed for this API. We had some discussions with the React team, and we said, we've got these problems, and we kind of need React to do this work for us. And they made the API, put it out as an alpha. I tried it out. You can actually see the PR where I was trying this. Like, I tried it, and it's like, wait, it doesn't do this other thing that I need. And Andrew Clark would go back, make some more changes, publish a new version, and I would try it again. It's like, okay, that fixed this problem. This other thing still breaks. And we went back and forth on that for a few weeks. And finally, it did everything that React Redux needed. And the idea was, if this new API works well for React Redux, it should work for other libraries like Jotai and ZooStand and everybody else. So by solving our problem, we were intentionally making it work for the rest of the ecosystem.
That's pretty interesting. So Mark, so when I was taking the registration for this event, I got a couple of very interesting questions, which are not really related to Redux, but which is related to you maintaining Redux and creating Redux Toolkit. So does it feel overwhelming when you're maintaining such a huge library, which are used by so many people?
Yes and no, and yes in many different ways. I actually tweeted shortly before releasing React Redux version 8, like, it's really weird to think that when I hit the publish button, hundreds of thousands of developers are going to start using the code that I've written, and hundreds of millions of people are going to be using their applications shortly thereafter. Like, React Redux is used in Twitter, it's used in Slack, it's used in like lots of other large applications, which means that if I screw up, oh boy, that's going to affect a lot of people. So it is kind of, it is a little scary when you think about it that way. It's also a huge amount of responsibility. And I'll be honest, like, I take being a maintainer very seriously. It's also a lot of self-imposed responsibility. Like, no one ever said that I had to take this job. No one ever said that I have to spend a bunch of my free time doing this. I definitely do it. I definitely spend way more time on this than I should. But it is a responsibility that I take very, very seriously. The flip side of that, though, I've learned that I simply cannot solve all the problems. As much as I try, I can't answer all the questions. And I really do have to try to maintain a balance between doing other things and attempting to have something that resembles a life and doing the maintainer stuff that I want to. Like right now, it's summer here in the US and it's golf season, and I love playing golf. And so the last several weekends, I've been out on the golf course and I have not done much like maintainer work. And there's some things that I would like to do maintainer-ish, but I'm going to spend time trying to relax.
I felt a little light considering that you also face such issues. But one question from my end, I have read a lot about your blogs. I have seen those very long blogs. I have seen you writing your daily work journal. So, what is the motivation of doing that? How you can do it?
That's a good question. Like if you would come up to me in say early to mid 2015 and asked like, Mark, do you think you'll ever have anything useful to contribute to like the greater development community? I would have said no. No, like why would anyone care about anything that I have to say? And I never wanted to get involved in this like intentionally. If you look back at some of the articles and stuff, like it all happened by accident. But I mean, this does kind of go back to what I was saying a minute ago. Like, okay, there's a child story that we have here in the U.S. I don't know if this has ever made its way over to India, called The Little Red Hen. And in this story, there's a chicken that's like, I'm going to plant a field full of wheat. Is anybody going to help me? And all the animals say no. So she's like, okay, I'll do it myself. I'm going to cut all the wheat. Is anybody going to help me? No. So I'll do it myself. I'm going to like turn it into flour. I'm going to bake the bread. Does anybody want to help me? No. It's like, it's always, I'll do it myself. And I feel a little bit of that with Redux. Now, not entirely, because there are other, like Lenz Weber, Matt Sikowski, Tim Dorr are the full-time, or like the active maintainers who work with me. And there's been many people who have contributed like various features or docs or other things. So it's not like it's only ever been me. At the same time, if you look over the last 6 or 7 years, it has been a lot of me answering questions and doing the docs and all this other stuff. So there is a little bit of that sense of like, well, nobody else is going to take care of Redux. So I guess I'm it. So that is part of that balance between like, I like doing this and I feel the responsibility to do it, because if I don't, who is? But also I need to make sure that I don't spend too much time on it, because that's not healthy.
And how you get those triggers that somebody on the internet have mentioned Redux, so you have to like jump in and answer. So how you get those triggers that somebody have mentioned Redux, I should go there.
You would like, a lot of people have either accused me of being a bot, or they assume that I've got a whole bunch of like, email triggers or stuff. I don't. I just spend too much time on social media. The closest is that I often use TweetDeck for Twitter, and I do have one column set up to watch #Redux on Twitter. But honestly, the rest of it is I just spend too much time refreshing Reddit and Hacker News and React to Flux and everywhere else.
Okay, I promise 2 last questions. So one from Kushal, that he's like, so something offside. I'm curious, how do you maintain your job and maintain a great library at the same time?
That's a really good question. One is that I am either fortunate or unfortunate, depending on your point of view, to have a lot of free time. And so I spend a lot of my free time on Redux stuff because it's, like I said, it's a thing that I enjoy doing, and I have that responsibility. Um, I also do some of that stuff technically during day job hours, whether it be like responding to GitHub issues or, okay, yes, fine, responding on Reddit or Twitter during the day. I will say that I think I've been doing less social media during the day since I started my new job at Replay about 2.5 months ago, because I'm spending less time in meetings and more time working on interesting tasks. So I'm a little more focused on actually doing stuff. And my previous job, I spent a lot of time in meetings, and I was doing a lot of refreshing Reddit during those meetings.
We all are guilty for that. And one last question, which is asked by so many people, that what it will take for them or how they can get started as a contributor to Redux.
That's a good question. And I actually did a video interview with Tracy Lee of This.Labs a couple months ago that covered this exact topic. Like, how would I contribute to Redux? I don't have the link right now, but if you were to like search for like how to contribute to Redux and like this dot, it would probably pop up on YouTube. The short answer is, all three of our libraries are very mature. They've been around for years. There really aren't many bugs. The Redux core is done. We do actually have a TypeScript conversion that's sitting on the master branch for like 3 years now that we've never released. If we ever get around to releasing it, it'll be version 5. But even then, it's the exact same code, just with TypeScript built in. React Redux, I mean, we just released version 8. So far, there's been no bugs. Yay! But like we don't have plans to like really add new features or anything there. Redux Toolkit is where all the development work is going on. A lot of that has to do with RTK query. If you look at our issues and PRs, I think right now we've got about 160 open issues and about 20 or 30 open PRs. And like the vast majority of those are about RTK query, which tells me people are really interested in it. We have some features we want to add for Redux Toolkit 1.9 that would be like new options for RTK query or something. To be honest, my coworker, Lenz Weber, who created RTK query, is still the one who knows almost all that code. I have not really tried to add new features or options to RTK query myself, and we could use some help there. It is kind of complicated. There's no question about that. But there probably are other issues in the Redux Toolkit repo that someone could look through and like maybe try to reproduce a bug or like see a feature request and try to work on that. The other thing we always need is documentation. And documentation is how I got started with Redux in the first place. I volunteered to write an FAQ page for the Redux docs in January 2016. Like 3 years ago, I filed an issue on the Redux repo saying like, I want to rewrite all of our documentation. And I've been slowly chipping away at that. We have the style guide, the tutorial pages, some new usage pages. But there's a lot of our docs pages that are still showing older patterns. There's a bunch of other docs pages I would like to add, talking about things like folder structures and side effects and how to set up Redux with Next and all this other stuff. And again, frankly, I just don't have time to do all this stuff myself. And so if anyone out there is interested on trying to help contribute some of the docs, I think docs are a great place to get started with contributing with open source in general. You always need more documentation work on every project. And in a lot of ways, docs contributions can be more valuable than source code contributions. I mean, think about the number of people who will read through some of those pages and learn. So if anyone is interested, I'm always happy to like provide guidance if someone wants to work on making docs updates.
Well, I guess that answers the question. And we are 12 minutes ahead of our time, so I think it's
This
better
is
to
not a surprise.
I still have like 8 to 10 questions that I couldn't ask you, but that is still fine. You have answered a lot, and it was an amazing session. So thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks a lot for giving your time. Thank you everyone for joining in, and it was a wonderful session. I enjoyed every minute of it. I don't know about rest of you.
Thanks. Like I said, I'll try and put up the slides on my blog within the next couple of days.
Sure, sure, sure. That would be amazing. So thanks again, Mark. See you around.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Yep. Thank you. Have a great day.
All right. Thanks.